Welcome everyone, my name is Alexa and I'll be your host today. Thanks for joining us for Leveraging Open Source Tools for DevSecOps with Tom Stiehm and Jeff Payne. First, I would like to go over some features in Adobe Connect that you can use during today's web seminar. If you have not done so already, you can download a copy of the seminar materials from the resources section on the right side of your screen. All comments posted in chat are visible to everyone by default. However, if you experience any sort of technical difficulty and need assistance, in the upper right-hand corner of the chat panel, select Start Chat With, and then my name, Alexa Angel, to begin a private chat, and I'll be happy to help you immediately. You can use the status menu, which is located next to the main menu navigation at the top of your screen, to show agreement, ask the speaker to speak louder, or share some applause.
Thanks, Alexa. Good day, everyone. My name is Jeff Payne. I'm the founder and CEO of Coveros. I've been spending the last couple of decades building, testing, and deploying software, focused as well on integrating testing and security into the software development and test process. I'm also the technical editor for Agile Connection. If you're not familiar with Agile Connection, I encourage you to join. It's free. It's an online community of Agile and DevOps professionals. And every week on Agile Connection, we publish new content on Agile and DevOps and do collaboration types of activities on things like our TechWell Hub that we'll talk about in a bit. So that's a little bit about me. Tom, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Tom Stiehm. I'm the CTO of Coveros. What I do is oversight of all the technical projects, including the Agile and DevOps and DevSecOps projects we do. I have over 20 years of experience building software, deploying software, having it run in production. And I personally think that Agile and DevOps are the best ways to go to build software.
So for those of you that aren't familiar with Cabarrus, so we're an organization that helps companies accelerate their software delivery using Agile and DevOps. We started about 11 years ago. That's all we do. We do everything from Agile transformations and coaching to rolling up our sleeves and building and testing software using Agile to implementing DevOps, automation, and integrating security into DevOps, which today everyone's calling DevSecOps. We have over 75 training courses on Agile, DevOps, security, and testing, and a couple of open source products that we support as well, including an open source DevOps/DevSecOps toolchain and an Agile testing framework. Today, we're going to be talking about leveraging open source tools into DevOps, so for DevSecOps. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom to start talking about his techniques and approaches for doing that. Tom?
Thanks, Jeff. So just to get a quick definition of DevSecOps, it's really extending DevOps to include security and security concerns as a first-class citizen, and wrapping the security concerns into everything that we do, from requirements to testing and part of the delivery process. So the idea is that just like we're bringing together operations and development and testing, quality assurance together, we're rolling security into that as well. So we want to start off with what you want to do even before you write code. I think and that is the right thing before you write code. It could be at the beginning of the project. It could be as you iteratively produce your product using Agile methodologies. So you want to make sure that you define your security requirements and understand what your goals are, and do things like threat modeling and risk analysis so that you're thinking about who's going to be attacking the system or might be misusing the system, and how do we protect against that. And then leveraging those requirements to think about what kind of security gates you want in your pipeline, and making sure that you build those in as you build out your pipeline and build out your application. And this diagram gives you some idea of where you might include some of those quality gates. So you have static code analysis and software composition analysis. happening right away as you're building the software and running unit tests. You may have dynamic security testing happening with your functional tests. And what you see with mature teams doing is that they're constantly trying to figure out how to shift security testing left so that it gets built into the process. And toward the end, there are no surprises, and any final security testing or pen testing that you have to do, hopefully, rarely comes up with issues. This is a diagram that shows some of the open source tools that you might be using to help you do various things, and gives you an idea of how these tools might be leveraged and where in the process they might be leveraged. We'll talk about some of those tools later in the presentation. So to give you kind of a roadmap of where to start, we generally look at starting with static application security testing. One of the reasons we do this is that you've already got some kind of static analysis, most likely in your build pipeline. A lot of people start with SonarQube and adding in security rules to SonarQube and then looking at building on there. So it leverages where you're already going and how you're already building. Next, we then factor in usually software composition analysis. And again, this can be part of the process that you already have. It's just another stage in your build pipeline that you use to analyze the libraries that you're using and give you information on anything that might have security vulnerabilities, known security vulnerabilities built into it. Next, we usually move out into dynamic application security testing and leveraging the infrastructure that we've created to do functional testing and to also do some DAS testing in there, whether it's setting up a proxy and then having your existing automation or manual testing go through that proxy to do the DAS testing, or setting up some kind of automated aspects of your DAS testing. Both of those can be effective. Once we've kind of mastered those and we have them in place and we think we're getting value, we'll look at some more advanced things like interactive application security testing, real-time application security protection, or hybrid application security testing. We'll talk about those more later in the presentation. So when we start talking about SAST, what we're really talking about is looking at the code and determining if there are security issues that we can find just at the code level. This is really good for finding things like SQL injection, cross-site scripting issues, buffer overflows. Often the tools fit right into either your IDE, your build system, or your continuous integration engine. And you can easily pick up security rules in something like SonarQube, and you can see the results and remediate those results right from the environment you're working with. So these integrate fairly well with either your IDE or if you're using Jenkins or a lot of other CI engines. And then you want to make sure that what you're building the results of the SAS into your security quality gates, failing builds that trigger have some threshold that the software doesn't meet. These are some of the popular open source SAS tools. SonarQube we talked about a little. Some of the things that it works with well, like PMD, either find bugs or spot bugs, even find sec bugs. We like checkstyle as well. If you're on the .NET side, there are a couple of options. FXCOP is one of them that works really well for .NET solutions.
Hey, Tom. Hey, thanks for that. So let's take a quick break and do a poll. Tom's been talking about open source and tools for open source for DevSecOps. We did a poll on Twitter recently looking at what tools people are using. And I'm curious of the audience, what kinds of security testing tools are you using? Are they open source tools? Are they commercial tools? Are you using both? Are you not sure because it's really not in your area of expertise? Please just quickly vote here. And also feel free to vote on what your role is in the organization as well. We'll see what that says. So let's start with the role in the organization. So you should see the results of that survey at this point. Pretty good cross section, Tom. We've got people from test and security, some DevOps roles, DevSecOps roles, nice. Management involved, others. If you want, you can post your role in chat if it's not a role that we have here. But a pretty good cross section, I think, of different people, different roles in the org. This is what you want to see in DevOps, obviously. We look at tools. So most are using both. That's pretty much what we found on both Twitter and when we did this poll in the TechWell Hub, which is our Slack community. It was about 67% across Twitter and the Hub were using both open source and commercial. No one was using just commercial tools, which I thought was pretty interesting. And some were not sure, and like here, there were a few that were just using open source. Do you find that surprising, Tom? That no one's using just commercial tools?
I don't find it. I think both is fairly common. A lot of times, because although there are in some areas really good open source tools, in other areas, particularly the newer, more advanced things, we still see commercial tools more prevalent. And in some cases, there aren't really even open source tool projects that have begun to cover those niches.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, there are some environments, I'm guessing, where there just are not good open source solutions because the open source community hasn't really embraced those environments. So what do you think, if we go back to talking about SAS, static analysis tools, what are the pros and cons of the open source static analysis tools? Where do they work well? What are they good for? And where are they maybe not so great that you do need to consider, some commercial tools? Well, while we wait for Tom, I've certainly seen situations where they made sense and don't make sense. I mean, one of the nice things about the static tools is that they're very lightweight, which means they run quickly, which means you can put them into your build environments where you need things to run fast. There's Tom.
Yeah, sorry, for some reason
I lost you there,
disappeared
Tom.
for a little while.
See that? Yeah, so I just asked you about pros and cons of open source tools for SaaS. You got on where it makes sense to use open source, where it makes sense to use commercial, specifically for SaaS?
Yeah, I definitely think the first thing you want to do is open source and leveraging the things in SonarQube are an equivalent to start getting an idea of where your vulnerabilities are. And then depending on the nature of your application and how exposed it is, you might look at moving into some of the commercial tools that give you more in-depth, like flow control analysis and data flow analysis. Some applications really, if you're going to be a large application on the internet that has a lot of interest in people attacking it, make a lot of sense to do as much as possible. An internal app where most of your users are part of your organization, moving to that level of analysis may be more than what you need. But definitely in the beginning, start with open source. You'll also find some advantages in open source with the community and the community support. Often with the commercial software, you have to go back to the vendor to get any kind of support or resolve issues. And most of them are pretty good about that, but they have their the priority in which they address issues and kind of their idea of what's important for them to do next.
You see the open source community keeping up with rule sets and things? Are they good about keeping track of new vulnerabilities or weaknesses that are discovered in languages and getting those quickly into the open source product? Or do you think the commercial tools are more effective?
One of the things you have to be careful with open source is making sure that your project still has either the founder or someone who's interested in maintaining it. As long as you have that group of people who are managing it is usually fairly good about keeping up to date. One of the things you see with some open source projects is that the people who founded it decided that they don't have time to devote to it anymore, and so it can start falling behind. So just understanding who's supporting it and what their goals are can really help you with that issue.
Great. Thanks for the advice. Let's keep going.
So for software composition analysis, this is really looking at your third-party libraries and determining kind of two things. Are there known vulnerabilities in them? And what open source licenses do they use? And what do their dependencies use? A lot of organizations want to understand what open source license they have and not use some specific open source licenses for various reasons. So you really have to look at your software and understand what you're using. A good open source tool for that is OWASP's dependency check. It really helps you understand what your tools are using and what their dependencies are, so you can know if there are common vulnerabilities, known vulnerabilities for them, and what licenses you're using.
That's awesome. So some pros and cons here. Do you see a big difference between the open source tools that are available for SCA and the some of the commercial tools? I know we've seen Sonatype, Black Duck, and some other commercial tools as well. What do you think about the open source tools?
So one of the big things with SCA is having that constant flow of updates about known vulnerabilities and being able to determine what licenses the libraries use. And OWASP in general does a pretty good job. A lot of the commercial SCA tools have a team of people that's what they do. And so they might be a little ahead of some of the open source ones. Depending on how important those things are. I mean, known security vulnerabilities is always a big issue. So that's usually pretty important. Depending on how exposed your application is, that may or may not be something where going the extra mile and paying for something that is updated on a more even basis is worth it.
Yeah, I think the other thing to consider that I've noticed is that a lot of the commercial tools give you I'd say a lot more help for remediation. So what do I do about these issues, right? And context around the issue, so you can figure out how important you think it is, or how critical it is to correct it. Have you seen things like that in terms of the knowledge base that the commercial tools provide as compared to the open source?
Yeah, you definitely get more help with the knowledge base and a lot of times reporting. So the open source usually first looks at how do we resolve the immediate issue, and it takes more time to get to the point where you get these finer grained things of how do we help people understand what to remediate, how do we help them report up better. And so those are some of the advantages that a lot of commercial tools have, is that they have better facility for that built into them from the beginning.
Great. No, it makes perfect sense. Thanks, Tom. Let's keep rolling.
So let's move on to talking about dynamic application security testing. And this is really running your application in an environment and having a tool that's using it like a client would, generally a web application or web services, to try to find out are there things that that the software can determine are vulnerabilities that might be exploited. And you often see it looking for things like authentication and authorization issues, information disclosure, giving the clients more information than what you really want them to do, and then things like command injection and SQL injection. And there's a lot of good open source tools around this specific function. Most of them focus on web, HTML, HTTP, web services. And one of the things that you can do is set it up in a proxy mode, so you can just have your regular testing process, whether it's automated or testing, or a combination of the two, go through the proxy and get a lot of the information that you need on what vulnerabilities exist there and how to deal with them. There are a few tools for non-web protocols, but those aren't generally focused on a lot. Some of the good tools that open source tools that we've used and have some experience with include OWASP Z Attack Proxy or ZAP. That's probably the one that we use and see used the most. Burp Suite is also one that has some open source to it. It's one of the freemium model solutions that a lot of people use and like a lot. Metasploit, Nick2 is another popular one, and then Nmap, Network Map, and SQL Map. SQL Map finds potential SQL injection issues. Those are all good things to set up and run against your software.
That's good stuff. So do you see a difference here in the open source and the commercial tools for DAST? Any difference with what we saw in SAST or SCA in terms of the quality of the open source tools?
The open source tools are high quality. They have a lot of the pros. A lot of it are the big communities around the tools. Some of the commercial tools, although they're high quality as well, it's a more closed community. It's wrapped around the vendor, and sometimes it's hard to get information about them. Whereas the open source community is a little more open. Some of the, this is one place where I think open source is starting to catch up to commercial in terms of support for how best to remediate things, creating reporting capabilities. So putting in some of those finishing touches is kind of where some of this software is now versus even with the SAST, it's still a little behind where the commercial software is in terms of those management features.
How about integrating these tools into your DevOps process? Is there anything about DAST or you mentioned proxy stuff before, or even SAST that makes it easier or more difficult with commercial versus open source? Or what's your assessment of the ease of integration?
So one of the advantages that the open source has is that you don't have any of the license restrictions and or data volume restrictions that you have with some of the commercial tools. So if you wanted to put ZAP in all of your environments, it's easy to do, and there's no license or no negotiation you have to do to be able to do that. Putting some of the commercial tools and treating them the same way that you would an open source tool is either going to be prohibitively expensive or something you have to go negotiate with the vendor. So there is some benefit in not having those commercial license concerns that can make it a little easier.
Okay. Well, that's great.
Some of the advanced DevSecOps tooling that you might consider is, we talked about interactive security testing, and that's really a technique of running an agent within your application as you do either your manual testing or using DAST tools, and getting that to show you in real time if you run into a vulnerability that it could be exploited and how to deal with that. One of the advantages of IAST is that it usually has a much lower false positive rate. So when it does find something, you're fairly sure it's an actual issue you have to fix. Runtime application self-protection is using the same idea as IAST to have an agent watching your application as it runs, but then you set it up and configure it to, if it detects a vulnerability being exploited, it would do something about it, like terminate the session for the user that seems to be trying to do a SQL injection attack, and then not letting that user log in again. Hybrid application security testing, or HAST, is really using DAST and IAST together to try to find and correlate bugs, and sometimes you even pull in information from a SAS scan where you're looking at all the inputs and saying, if we find it using this hybrid approach, then we really know this is a vulnerability that we need to fix, and helps us prioritize that. One of the downsides of some of these more advanced things is that their open source hasn't really caught up to that yet. The one exception we found is OpenRasp from Baidu. It's an interesting project that we've just started looking into, but it gives you an idea of that there are, as these techniques become more mainstream, there will be some open source coming out that will help you leverage them. The next thing that we always like to remember to do is all the development stuff is really good and powerful, but don't forget your actual operating environments. And so part of the DevSecOps there is there are a number of open source tools that will help you scan your environment and your network and make sure that you have closed anything in your production environment that is open by default, hardened your production environment. Tools like OpenVAS that scans your servers themselves. Nagios is a tool that helps you monitor and manage your network. And like Kali Linux is a tool that puts a lot of these penetration testing and security testing tools together and helps you manage excuse me, your ability to test those and keep those going. The other thing you want to think about in terms of production is some kind of intrusion detection system, or a Stiehm, an information security and event management system. And these are really systems that wash the traffic, monitor the network, and try to determine if someone is attacking the system or if someone is doing something that they shouldn't be doing, detecting any kind of anomalies or malicious activity. And so there's a number of good tools in this area. One of them, from a Stiehm point of view, is the Elk Stack. Now, this is a log management system that you use to collect all your logs and then decide things about what's happening in your logs. The Elk Stack itself isn't necessarily a Stiehm. It lacks correlation and incident management, but a lot of the open source Stiehm tools start with Elk Stack. So as you're beginning to do this, this would be a good place to start, put Elk Stack in place. Excuse me. Start getting information about what's happening in your environment, and then looking at some of the other open source alternatives that would ride on top of Elk Stack and use that to query and do incident management and correlation. And this is an example of a monitoring stack. This is actually what Etsy uses. They chose to use Nagios. We talked about a little earlier. They created a package called StatsD to help them collect information about their network and do application instrumentation. Then they dashboard that using Graphite and Ganglia to help them see what's going on and what's happening. And then they use an open source tool that they also created called Kale for anomaly detection and correlation, which is looking at users' behavior, deciding if they're doing something unusual that might be something we don't want them to do, and then reacting to that and notifying someone, turning off their session, anything in there.
Good stuff, Tom. So we have another poll we want to open real quick here. And this one is, are you doing this stuff? So we talked SaaS, DAST, other things. Are you integrating security into your DevOps process at this point? Or is this something you're just here to learn a little bit about and see what's available? Or are you not sure? Give everyone an opportunity to go ahead and fill in that poll. Not a lot of voters, but almost everyone said yes. So people are doing this kind of stuff. Always good to hear. It's important. We are going to take questions, but before we do that, I want to give you some additional information. For those, thanking you for participating today, we are going to send you, after this webinar, a link to the webinar itself, but also a coupon for a discount, a 10% discount on some upcoming opportunities to learn more about security testing, and DevSecOps. Here are some of the things coming up that you could apply that to. We have a live virtual security testing class. It's happening at the end of March. We are also having a week-long DevOps week here in the Washington, D.C. area. This is something we've been doing now for several years. We cover, it's our 2-day DevOps class. It's hands-on classes with Docker and Chef and Jenkins file and Kubernetes and all that fun stuff, as well as a leadership summit and workshop for DevOps professionals. And then we have our upcoming Star East conference, which is the largest testing conference in the world. That's held every year in early May. Come join 1,200 of your closest friends to talk about anything associated with testing. There are tracks and talks and tutorials and training on security testing, DevSecOps, web security, all sorts of security related things, as well as functional testing and non-functional testing opportunities there to check out. The other thing we want to make you aware of is something that's new, and that is the TechWell Hub. So the Hub is a way to take the conversations we're having here today and keep them going. So instead of leaving a webinar or a training class or a conference or whatever it is you're at, learning about some new topic, go to the Hub and we'll continue the conversations that are happening. This QR code, if you point your camera at it, it'll bump you to the Hub, or you can just jump to the URL shown here and sign up. It is free. And there's a whole bunch of different channels on DevOps and security and testing and Agile. And you can, converse more than we're conversing here on this webinar. Tom and I will be on as well if you're interested after the webinar and in continuing the conversation. But we are going to take some questions now as well. Let's jump over and take some questions. We have some in the chat history. First, what is your impression of the DHS Swamp? Advantages, disadvantages of using the Swamp? First of all, really bad choice of names. But I know the DHS Swamp has been around a lot longer than the current use of the word swamp. Tom, are you familiar with what DHS is doing with what they call Swamp? Have you seen that? If not, I've seen some of it.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with it.
So those not familiar, so it stands for Software Assurance Marketplace, and what it is it's a set of tools, open source tools, I believe primarily, although I know they have some sponsors that are commercial. I'm not sure if that means they have a paid version or not. I haven't kept up with it that much, but it allows you to submit code and access tools and run analysis against those tools. I haven't used the Swamp in quite a while, and so what I don't know is how well the Swamp integrates into a DevOps process. So for instance, can you use it in real time continuously as you're making changes to your code? As I recall, at least when I was looking at it, and again, this was a few years ago or so, it was more a managed service where you basically submitted your code, or it gave access to your code, or to your code to run analysis on, and it wasn't set up to be part of an ongoing continuous process. But I wouldn't be surprised if that's something that is now supported.
Yeah, that's one of the big challenges we see with people adopting DevSecOps is that their current security processes are meant to be, even if it's internal, it's kind of a third party managed from the point of view of the development teams. So it's something that they submit to someone else toward the end of their development, and they're having to rethink how they do everything and how they integrate tools into their process to make it more continuous. As we, the goal of DevSecOps is to get to continuous delivery. And if you have this point in time event to do, quote unquote, do security, you have a lot of work to rework that so that it can be more continuous.
Yep, no, that's a good point. And I know, as you mentioned, a lot of the commercial product vendors in the security space, because they oriented their product, as they should have when it came out, around the idea that this was going to be done by a security team who would typically do that at the end of the life cycle once for each release. It was set up more like a service that you submitted code to or you accessed periodically instead of an ongoing analysis. And they're trying to figure out how to take technology that was built for that model and apply it to one that has to be quick, it has to be fast, it has to be incremental, right? You can't be running and redoing results constantly because you won't run fast enough.
Well, one of the things you're seeing too is the mindset of the application security professionals changing from being a we do this for you to we enable you to get this done. And so they become enablers rather than a hurdle someone has to cross. And that mind shift is something that a lot of organizations that have existing application security practices are struggling to get through.
Yeah, that's a great point. We even see that on our projects, right? I mean, a lot of times when we're brought in to help build things using Agile and automate tests, we naturally just start putting in place, SAST and DAST tools because we want to get that feedback immediately. We don't want to wait till the end of the process for the security team to tell us there's vulnerabilities. We want to find them every day, and so we're just naturally running them and not waiting for the security team to show up, if you will. And that's, I think, part of the cultural aspect of DevSecOps is getting the security team integrated into the rest of your DevOps team, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for a long time, the best practice was this is a separate group that you only talk to when you do your release every 6 months or every year. And now the best practice is integrate in security from the beginning. And so you need security people to help you and be enablers to make sure your application secure from the beginning, and that you're thinking about security the whole way through, which is the focus of DevSecOps, is to get security to be a first-class citizen in the DevOps process.
Yep. Let's answer some other questions that came in. So the next question was, do you have an opinion regarding software vulnerability managers, such as Defect Dojo? Are they any good? Are they useful? Your thoughts on that,
Yeah,
Tom?
I think that if you don't have an established process and you're trying to find one, using those can help you think about that. I wouldn't adopt any software just to adopt software. I would try to find one that fits your process and your needs. We generally try to stay pretty agnostic to specific tools because we often go into organizations that have established things, and we only really recommend that they change tools if what they have just doesn't fit where they want to be. So in general, I don't recommend any specific tools. I try to work with people and see what they have now and if it fits where they want to go.
Yeah, and that's a good point. If you have tools in your organization and they work and they give you what you need, you really want to use what you've already invested in if at all possible. As Tom mentioned, we don't like to replace tools unless you just find out that tool doesn't work in the process. So maybe it's not ready to be used continuously in a DevOps process, and there doesn't appear to be any hope that it ever will be. Then maybe you need to replace it. But other than that, you want to use what you've invested in, if at all possible. Next question we have is, are there open source tools that support compliance to various standards, such as NIST 800-53, et cetera, et cetera? Are you familiar with any compliance-oriented security tools, Tom?
Yeah, so OpenVAS and OpenSCAP will help you with those kind of compliance issues. Probably OpenSCAP.
Those are OWASP products, right? Are they OWASP?
Sorry?
Are they OWASP? From OWASP?
I don't believe that they are, no. I could be wrong, but OpenSCAP is probably the one you want to use, and it's really like a reference implementation for SCAP. And we have used it with clients in the past and even internally ourselves to do that kind of compliance checks, particularly for government contracts.
Yep. Next question. The tools that were discussed today, how can we use them in a CI/CD pipeline? And so I assume what that question really is where do you put them, right?
Right.
Where do you put them in the process from CI to CD, and how do they kind of fit into that continuous process you're trying to get set up?
So if you look at, we had a slide early on where you generally start looking at static analysis in the same place where you do your unit tests, your compilation and unit tests. Depending on what tools you're using, some of them run fairly fast. Most of the SonarQube tests, including the security tests, which will give you a lot of information about your security posture, run fairly quickly, and so you have that in your first immediate feedback cycle. Longer running static analysis will put further out in your feedback cycle in your pipeline. We usually then put composition analysis in the later feedback cycle. So you look at that after you feel that your build's good and can continue testing. And then generally we marry DAST with your functional testing and that functional testing cycle, particularly if you're using a proxy to collect information. And so those are where we'd start putting those. And then we do, if you have further penetration testing, really penetration testing I generally define as a human being that's using tools to figure out how your software might be exploited through like trust relationships and things that aren't easy for software to find. That's as far down your pipeline as possible where you might have any manual testing that you feel you have to do. Some organizations that are doing continuous delivery or continuous deployment will even do those kinds of activities after they've deployed to production, because they feel that if they do find something, they have enough confidence in their pipeline and their process that they can either roll back or roll a fix forward relatively quickly.
So is it fair to say, Tom, that, I mean, obviously, one practical piece of advice I know you give is, it depends on how long the tool takes to do its analysis, right? So you were mentioning SonarQube is really quick and simple. It's integrated into your builds and usually into, whatever you're using to manage those builds. And so it's really easy to use in your continuous integration process, because it runs very quickly and you can run it on every change that you do, and it'll track and show results over those changes. If you want to do complex, detailed code scanning and code analysis, control flow, data flow, things like that on your changes, you're not going to run those every time you check in a new piece of code, probably, right? You're going to do maybe a nightly regression build or something like that, or as you mentioned, whenever you go into your functional aspects.
You might also parallelize the build depending on what your goals are, but those things can take tens of minutes to hours to do, depending on the depth that you're going into. So they certainly aren't in your early fast feedback cycle. You're right, you do want them sometime generally before you go to production. Some people will set up their pipeline to be able to go to production in 20 minutes, half an hour if they pass certain tests, and then continue to do tests on the software in a environment parallel to production afterward. And that's where you'd run some of your long running things and do the things that take hours to scan and then remediate those the next day. So those
that makes sense. Do you think it makes
organizations that have been doing DevSecOps for a while that have come to that in their risk analysis, they think it's acceptable?
What do you think about the idea of, so you mentioned, pen testing and, the fact that, of course, that's part manual, part automated. So it's obviously not something you're going to do on every, check-in or every change. What do you think about the idea as kind of the definition of done for your sprint, let's say, that you try to incorporate pen test into that definition of done, so you're getting out of your sprints what you might call something releasable, right? Do you think that's a viable thing to try to do, and also a way to get security kind of pulled in, the security people pulled in? What do you think about that idea?
The biggest challenge I see to that at most organizations is that the number of people that they have that pen testing skill set is not large enough to support every team, every sprint doing some amount of pen testing. So your options are either get more people with that or train some of your testers to be able to do some of that work. And then have your experts be the ones who do the really in-depth things and be mentors to the people in testing who are developing that skill set. And that might be the best way to go, is start developing the skill set internally and using your experts as mentors for people who want to learn that skill set.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I hadn't even thought about. I mentioned earlier that we're running a live virtual version of our security testing class. I mean, that security testing class, the whole idea behind it is this is a class to teach professional testers enough about security so they can start to participate in the security process. And that gets to your second alternative, right? If you can't get enough people with security expertise from your security group every sprint, well, then you're going to have to figure out, how do I train my team how to perform some of the pen testing and other security aspects that I want coming out of my sprint.
Yeah, so I mean the people on the ground on the teams are the ones who are going to be able to do something every sprint. And so the challenge is giving them enough capability to do that, and then giving them someone who's a mentor that can help them gain more skill and realize when they need a different level of experience to take that one step further.
Well, that makes sense. So another question we had pop up was, which one is better for security from a security point of view, Veracode? It's a pretty broad question.
Yeah, I mean, OWASP is
I assume that the question is, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, OWASP is an organization that has lots of different software. So if you want a broad view of what software you should have to help increase your security posture, it'd be OWASP. If you're asking which security static analysis tool is better, I'd probably look at Veracode, but I think I'd want to understand the question a little better.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, Veracode is a commercial product. It's a good product. It's got a good reputation out there, and you get the pros and cons with open source between what OWASP has available for static analysis versus something like Veracode.
Yeah, I mean, if what you're looking at is just static analysis, then and you want to buy a commercial product, between those two choices, I would go with Veracode as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Any other comments or thoughts, Tom, on this process, or anything else about DevSecOps and tools that you want to emphasize to the audience before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think the big thing is that we like to leverage open source, but as we saw with all the polls we did in people's experience, DevSecOps, really you need to integrate both open source and commercial tools and pick the tool that's best for your situation and context. And sometimes that will be the open source tool. Sometimes that'll be the commercial tool. We will see open source tools start to go into some. I mean, IAST is a new niche. We see a lot of commercial tools heading in that direction. The open source tools will come after time, after the niche has proven itself. And so if you want to get into that today, you're going to have to go commercial tool. 10 years from now, it'll be a different story.
Yep. No, that makes perfect sense. So just to wrap up, our Twitter handles are on this last slide. Both Tom and I tweet a lot on Agile, DevOps, security, test automation, test. Please follow us on Twitter, and please head over to the TechWell Hub after the webinar. I know I'll be hanging out there and answering questions, and we can continue this dialogue over on the Hub.